Hello and good afternoon, RSA. My name is Brian Green. I am the CISO for the Americas at Zscaler. And today, I will be presenting the NIST 800-207 playbook, which will define a zero trust journey that really talks about moving from the whiteboard ultimately to the boardroom. I'm especially excited to give this talk today because, ironically enough, in our industry, it's virtually impossible to talk about anything cybersecurity related and not really talk about zero trust. But ironically, the NIST standard for zero trust architectures, which is 800-207, has never been presented at RSA. So I feel extremely honored to present this critical topic. I'm firmly a believer that zero trust really represents a critical architectural shift in terms of how we do cyber, especially as technologists and practitioners. So we've got a very busy session today. Again, thank you all for your attendance. This room is absolutely packed, so I really appreciate the support. So we've got a full agenda for this hour. What I will tell you in terms of how this presentation is structured is, a pretty disparate audience in here. So we really wanted to start kind of at the 30,000-foot view of what zero trust is. So we're going to start with a little bit of a history lesson in terms of the evolution of trust. So we'll talk about a quick journey from the 1990s until the present day. Then we'll move into some of the zero trust architecture. Some of the fundamentals, so really get deep into what is 800-207 talking about, what are some of the methodologies and strategies that they really talk about. Then we'll move into ultimately how you build and define your zero trust strategy at your organization. So talking about methodologies and really getting to the, back to the title of the presentation is really getting to a place where you can move beyond the whiteboard into the practical. And then last but not least, we'll close with adoption best practices. So how do you implement zero trust in your organization, how to socialize it with your board, how to get stakeholder buyout in your organization. So let's get started. So evolution of trust. This is chapter 1 of this presentation. So I started my career, I'm going to date myself a little bit. I started my career in about 1994. I was serving in the United States Air Force, and obviously, tech was very different in those days. But again, going back to zero trust, in the 1990s, things, trust was very, very simple. There was the dirty internet, which was bad and untrusted, just very simply. And then you had your internal corporate network, or the enterprise, which was mostly flat, widely trusted, and considered safe for all intents and purposes. So the 1990s, this trust model was so widely adopted that you literally see this trust model expressed in hardware. So I had to include this. It's absolutely my favorite slide in this deck. If you look closely, hopefully you can see the actual network interfaces or the NICs here, but they literally say trusted and untrusted on them. And laughter is absolutely the right response to this picture. So again, going back to that previous slide, if you were inside the firewall, you were considered to be on the trusted network. But if you were outside, very simply, you were untrusted. So very, very simple trust model in that perspective. So as we pivot into the 2000s, what we see is trust was just extended a little bit. So at the bottom there, you see those additional lines sort of moving out away from the corporate network. This is where we started to really build wide area networks, where we started to build metropolitan area networks. And really, the purpose here was really to extend connectivity out to your branch offices. So we also started to see the rise of remote users. They began accessing the network over things like IPsec and GRE tunnels. But the idea here was that they just really needed to get into, because this trust model was very simplistic, they just needed to get access into the trusted corporate network, where they effectively had carte blanche to move laterally, access applications, and whatever resources they needed to. Around this time, we also started to see some instances of network segmentation. So very early days, obviously, but you would see this with potentially certain types of VLANs, certain types of subnets, really with a distinct purpose, right? I think, historically you often see this as DMZs or server subnets, or networks that only had VoIP traffic or other types of communications on them, and so on and so forth. So this is a high level of what we saw in the 2000s. So as we move into the 2010s, we just continued to extend trust. So we had this trust model, and it just continues to sort of proliferate. So network and security complexity really started to explode here. This is when things started to get really, really challenging in terms of being a practitioner and really building effective security controls. So we started to see SaaS, obviously Salesforce invented SaaS. SaaS really started to proliferate in the industry. We also started to see the emergence of things like cloud computing, public cloud, private cloud, so on and so forth. So again, we continued to extend these networks out to these different locations. And we're also talking here about private data centers. We're talking about co-location facilities, so on and so forth. If you had infrastructure running anywhere, the idea was that you just simply extend your network and have IP connectivity to these various resources. The other part that's worth noting here is that more and more types of endpoints were still connecting to VPN. So we started to see the emergence of things like BYOD, unmanaged devices, massive expansion of things like vendors connecting into your network. So if you had heating and air conditioning systems or OT, operational technology, or IoT, these things need to be managed, building infrastructure, so on and so forth. So again, a very network-centric approach and very much predicated on IP addresses, subnet masks, source destination IPs, these sorts of things. Massive complexity, and really didn't do a sufficient job of really mitigating risk. So this brings us to the present day, so the 2020s. I would actually say this is when trust is really starting to be reimagined. You can see that this diagram looks significantly different than the others in that this is really, we're really moving into a world today where the world really requires an any-to-any connectivity model, right? You've got endpoints talking to other endpoints, you've got workloads talking to workloads, you have workloads talking to IoT, there's edge computing, private cloud, public cloud, so on and so forth, right? Just a massive amount of connectivity. So again, highly interconnected world, any-to-any connectivity model, and I would say this is probably the area in which the network security model really started to break, and we needed to kind of rethink this. The network security controls that we had in place were just too difficult and too complex to manage, and ultimately, I would say this is the architecture that ultimately got us to zero trust, and really the creation of zero trust. So why is this important? Well, again, as I previously mentioned, it's critically important that as practitioners, as technologists, that we really embrace this idea that these hub and spoke networks, these castle and moat security models, these defense in depth models, they've really failed us as an industry, and I think there's sort of no going back to that. It's a little bit painful for me as a practitioner because I've spent literally my entire career building those types of networks. So moving to this model, I think that's why I have so much passion about this topic, is that it really is fundamentally different, and it absolutely is a game changer. So in terms of why these models failed, kind of 5 major reasons. I think first is that the network security models, they don't really address the current threat landscape. What we're seeing with things like ransomware, advanced persistent threats, these sorts of things, it just doesn't sufficiently address those. Next is that a lot of the network security-based controls, they really require backhauling. So this is, if you have a technology stack that you have sitting in your data center or in your public cloud, getting that traffic back to that stack is a requirement, frankly, to make sure that that traffic goes through your tech stack. With that, what you end up doing is you end up sacrificing performance, you end up sacrificing agility, and these things are very detrimental, right? We can't, as practitioners, acknowledge that availability and performance are really part of our responsibility as practitioners. The other bit with network security models is that technical debt. I know that we all like to talk about technical debt, but really when we talk about complexity and technical debt is when you get into a position where you're managing hundreds or thousands of firewalls, different types of IP subnetting. They're just not really effective controls, and they don't give you the security outcomes that you're really looking to really reduce risk across your organization. The other bit is policy enforcement is inconsistent. So if you have to backhaul some of your traffic, but then maybe you're doing split tunneling and you're not backhauling other parts of it, you get into a place where your policy enforcement is just really inconsistent. So depending on if you're at headquarters or if that traffic is originating from your data center, you do not have the means or the technical ability to apply all the same rules to all of your traffic. So we're talking here north-south traffic, we're talking east-west traffic, and so on and so forth. So the TLDR for this is that doing and trying to build a network and doing cybersecurity on a network security model contributes to really just fragmented architectures, continues to just really decrease the efficacy of your overall cybersecurity program. So now the good news. Where do we go from here? So in 2019, NIST released the very first draft of 800.207. They released that in September of 2019, and they had a couple of major objectives in mind with writing this document. So first is that they really wanted to define zero trust principles. Obviously, the most critical of that is no implicit trust. I know there's, within the industry, it's, we hear a lot of, zero trust. My version of this is that, zero trust isn't necessarily a product, but it's really a set of principles, a set of guiding architectures that really help organizations really pivot to this. So I'm not a firm believer in, buying zero trust off the shelf. That really isn't a thing. But what you can do as technologists and practitioners is you can start applying these zero trust principles to your network and to your organization, be it network security or your identity security, how you address endpoint security and those sorts of things. So that's really, at its root, what we're really focused on talking about. And again, zero trust is, again, pivoting away from this network security model to an identity-centric security model. So how do we effectively leverage identity? How do we consume that in a meaningful way? And then also getting into things like context. So context is critically important for cybersecurity practitioners, right? So just because you can authenticate and authorize someone, that's great. But what about going deeper, right? Is that a corporate managed device? Does that corporate managed device follow your security posture? Things like disk encryption, volume encryption. Is it running a particular type of group policy that you enforce? So really moving into this using deep and rich metadata and other types of attributes to really understand and authorize connections through your organization. The next bit here is really getting into the more contemporary, more modern threat landscape, right? The threats that exist today are very different than the threats that existed 3, 5, 7 years ago. So Zero Trust really does an effective job of making sure that the threat landscape that currently exists today, that you have controls in place that really mitigate those risks. We're talking things like cloud computing, obviously, BYOD, unmanaged devices, so on and so forth. And then lastly, ZTA just completely eliminates the network from being the primary security control. So chapter 2, Zero Trust Architecture Fundamentals. So we're going to get into a little bit of some of the principles and concepts here. And this is really according to NIST 800.207. So I thought this visual would help. This visual here really talks, we have on the left-hand side, really a network security architecture. We should all be very familiar with these. These things have existed for 25 plus years. But the idea here is really about control. Controlling everything. Really controlling the network, all of the endpoints. This is ultimately how you solve concepts like NAC. If you have NAC deployed in your organization or network access controls, this is really about making sure that before people get onto your network, that you're enforcing various types of controls. Maybe you're looking for certain types of certificates, maybe certain types of authentication, maybe even certain device posture things. But again, how that's very different than Zero Trust is not putting folks onto the network. And again, what you also see on the left-hand pane here is that, again, this is all about full IP connectivity. So making sure that users, once they join the network via VPN, maybe they're physically hardwired, maybe they're on Wi-Fi, but once they have access, they really, unless you have some screening firewalls or other types of internal segmentation, they really just have a flat network with full IP connectivity. Again, very rigid, very authoritarian style approach. Based primarily on IP address controls. So moving into the right, this is where we really start getting into the differences here and how the Zero Trust architecture is fundamentally different. So what you can see is basically all things here connect into this common substrate. We often call this the policy enforcement point. These are NIST terms, the PEP. And we'll get a little bit deeper into the various parts of the architecture. But what you see is a model in which all connectivity flows through this brokered central point, which really allows an opportunity to enforce either your business policy or whatever cybersecurity policy you define. But again, this is in an any-to-any connectivity model. And again, identity and context are going to be the primary security controls in this type of setup. And I think what this also does, and I think critically important when we talk about things like technical debt, is that this really, if you look at the right-hand side, it really results in a more simplified and more secure architecture. I would also say that it's also infinitely more scalable as well. Whereas on the left-hand side, you have to continue to build these interconnections and continue to extend networks, whereas on the right, you basically just need to connect into the policy enforcement engine. So macro trends. So there are a lot of macro trends that I think are just broadly happening in tech, a lot of macro trends that are broadly happening in cyber. And I think these are important things for us to really keep in mind as we approach some of these challenges is, first what we saw is really application transformation. So as the data centers for 25 plus years really were the center of gravity for all things. All of your resources live there, all of your critical infrastructure, all of your crown jewel applications, they really lived in the data center. So as applications started to really move forward, when we saw things like SaaS computing, cloud computing, both public and private cloud really come out, is we started to really move out of the data center and we started to move workloads basically everywhere. And that really created some unique challenges. Then we started to move into network transformation. A lot of this was obviously rapidly accelerated with things like COVID and people working remotely from home. But if you were in the business of doing networking, what you rapidly saw was organizations moving away from these super complicated corporate networks or enterprise networks and really moving into a direct internet model. We saw a lot of this with COVID and people working remotely from home or working from Hawaii or working from coffee shops and so on and so forth. So again, really from a transformation perspective, this was very disruptive for both IT, networking, and from a cybersecurity perspective. And then lastly, as we move into security transformation, this is really about moving away from these rigid network security architectures and moving to a zero trust architecture. Really cloud-delivered, cloud-native type security solution. So again, these trends are critically important, I think, as we start to really plan for future state architectures, is to really understand where your organization is or where your enterprise is in terms of these. I think different organizations, what I've seen are in wildly different places. Maybe you've gone all in and you've moved entirely to public cloud and to SaaS, but your network transformation still looks very legacy, or vice versa. So again, as you start to think about migrating to zero trust, these are very, very critical things to really understand in terms of what is happening in the broader ecosystem as you stop, really take your head out of the cybersecurity world and start to look into, the CIO's world or your CTO's world of things like application and network transformation. Okay, so this is a zero trust view of the network. So I think, again, it's critically important to understand how zero trust architectures are very different than these network security architectures, and these are kind of the high level things. So I would say first, and probably my favorite, is that when you move to zero trust, there is an assumption that threat actors are always present on your networks. So again, I would say philosophically, it's a very different approach than network security, right? Where if you have a corporate network or an enterprise network, you often think, well, this is safe. I manage all of these assets. I control all of these resources and all of the networking infrastructure. So trying to approach a problem when you know threat actors are present on your network, I think fundamentally changes how you do cyber and some of the decisions that you would make. Second is that not everything on the network is centrally managed or owned by your organization. So, who here does not have some third-party vendor, infrastructure? Maybe it's digital signage, maybe it's an elevator system in one of your headquarters buildings. But again, these are things that you don't manage. You can't secure them. You can't patch them. They're basically hands-off. So, how do you really approach these? Third, this is relatively obvious here, but no resource is inherently trusted, period. There are no exceptions to that. So, I think, by definition, I think zero trust kind of explains that quite well. Fourth here is that your enterprise resources will exist on infrastructure that you don't manage or own. So for example, the easiest use case here is some of your employees that are traveling. Maybe you're traveling to RSA to see a security conference. You are connecting your resources, your assets, maybe your phones, your mobile devices, maybe your laptops and so on, but you're connecting those to networks that you don't own or manage. So again, moving to a model where you really need to solve for some of the security challenges in this new environment. Fifth is assume breach. So again, all local networks are untrusted, period. There are no exceptions to that. And then lastly, cybersecurity policy and posture must always be enforced. And the part that's not up here is they're really talking about irrespective of location. So the idea here is that we shouldn't care where our workloads live. We shouldn't care where our endpoints live in the world. Maybe you're in London sitting at Heathrow Airport. You ought to still be able to have those same cybersecurity policies and those same security controls irrespective of where you are. So again, NIST 800-207 really defines 7 key tenets for zero trust. A little bit of a lengthy slide, so I'll try to get through this quickly, but generally they talk about most endpoint devices as resources. So here we're talking about multiple classes of devices, also data. So these are both managed and unmanaged type of devices. Second, because we assume breach and attackers being present on all networks, it's imperative that communications are protecting both confidentiality and integrity. Third is that access is evaluated every session, and the principle of least privilege is enforced. I think why this is important, and where you'll also start to see differences as we start to get into some of the more technical bits, is evaluating every session, right? Not just looking at a couple of packets and making traditional firewalls and making pass-through type connections in those types of devices. Fourth here is that policy is dynamic and based on multiple conditions. So again, this is where you really get into some of those deep contextual controls. Fifth is that both identity and posture are monitored, and what they're talking about here is really about continuous monitoring to ensure compliance. So just because you were able to connect to an application and you were able to get through the trust algorithm, that doesn't mean that conditions don't change. Maybe you turn off security controls on your endpoint. Maybe you turn off your firewall or antivirus. These types of things need to be continually monitored to maintain that persistent access. Number 6 here is really just talking about identity as the new perimeter, right? So this is making sure that we have both strong authentication and authorization prior to access. And then lastly, really trying to get into using various sorts of telemetry to enforce your policy enforcement. So, how are you consuming threat intelligence, for example, various types of TTPs and IOCs, looking at the observable state of both devices, the posture and the state of those devices, and also using things like behavioral and environmental attributes to really administer access. So this is literally cut and pasted right out of NIST 800-207. This is the diagram in which they really describe what the architecture from a visualization perspective looks like. So what we see on the outside of the diagram on both the left and the right-hand side is these are inputs, and you notice there's arrows moving in towards the middle. But what these inputs really do are really just providing inputs to your policy. So what you see here are things like inventory information, right? CMDBs, those sorts of things. We really talk about hardware inventories, threat intelligence, certificate infrastructure. You see PKI up there, and so on and so forth. So these are all inputs to the larger trust algorithm so that you can make better informed decisions. And then the middle is broken up really into 2 unique sections. So on the top, you see here, you've got the control plane, and then across the bottom, you've got the data plane. Different components in there. This is a little bit in the weeds, but it's important that both of these planes, both the control plane and the data plane, they're logically separate. We don't want to commingle or to cross paths here, so they're purposely kept separate. Really, what you see in the top is the control plane. So this is where a lot of the administrative activity happens. This is where you really define your policy. This is where you administer the controls and so on. And on the bottom, what you see is the data plane. So this is really about how you enforce various types of policies and so on. Chapter 3. So this is where we're going to get into actually building your zero trust strategy. So talk about some of the different methodologies and approaches. So at a very high level, we're going to dive much deeper into each of these, the whys and the whats and the hows. But as you get prepared to start moving into defining your zero trust strategy, there's kind of 3 major bucketed things that you should probably follow or that we're recommending that you follow. First is starting with the why, making sure that you really understand what are the drivers. Why are you doing this? What are the things that you're really trying to achieve? Second is to define the what. So this is where we get really deep into making sure that we understand what does that future state architecture look like. Some people are calling these things North Star architectures, but really making sure that we comprehensively understand what that architecture looks like. And then the last bit is really about the how. So how you execute the strategy, ultimately how you build the strategy and so on. So again, we'll dive deeper into these sections here. So starting with the why. So this is about really understanding the drivers, really the purpose. So on the left-hand side, we really talk about security drivers. And again, these are really talking about how you mitigate risk across your organization. So maybe there's a need to really prevent breach. Maybe there's new cybersecurity capabilities that you just don't have in your program. These are things like data loss protection or maybe even CASB type controls or various other things. Maybe it's securing cloud workloads, but these are a lot of the drivers. Or even just some common things like just really reducing attack surface in your organization. So we've got the security drivers on the left here, and as we move into the right, we start to also talk really about the business drivers. So what we're really getting at here is how is Zero Trust really improving business outcomes for your organization? What are the areas in your organization that you really need to improve? So these could be things like, what is cyber's impact on things like revenue? How does it help your business ultimately be more agile? What we often see this, in a cyber perspective is things like remote work. From a business driver perspective, supporting remote employees is critically important. Also things like mergers and acquisitions and divestitures, which we'll get into as well. So here we talk about the what, and this really talks about the result of the Zero Trust architecture, really focusing on outcomes. And again, similar to the previous slide is that there are both security outcomes and business outcomes. So security outcomes really are generally about doing things like improving your overall cybersecurity maturity, making sure that you have a consistent security posture across your organization, whereas the business outcomes are really about things like cost reduction or potentially even supporting organizational type objectives. So the how. A little bit busy of a slide here, but the intent here is that we really wanted to illustrate and really thoroughly describe across the bottom here, you'll see inputs, you'll see the various processes and also outputs. But the idea here from a 30,000 foot view is that as you start to build your Zero Trust strategy, it can't be monolithic. You really need to take into a lot of different aspects into consideration. So across the left here, starting with the inputs, you'll see that there's a lot of different types of activities here. So really leveraging things like if you have a GRC or governance, risk management, and compliance program, really leveraging that data. So really deeply understanding what are the key risks within your organization. What are the risk assessments saying about your organization, things that you need to really solve for. Looking deeply at audit findings and those sorts of things to really deeply understand, where do we have potentially compliance gaps with various types of compliance frameworks and those sorts of things, or even mitigating things like internal audit findings and such. Also, really deeply understanding where your program is in terms of maturity. So there's a lot of different ways that you can measure maturity. Most organizations that I've seen are really aligned to the NIST CSF, the NIST cybersecurity framework. So really deeply understanding, do you have critical controls in place at the appropriate places? really looking at things like a capabilities maturity model to say, do I have all of the appropriate controls? Are all of those controls mature to the place where we need them to be to overall to support the program? And then the last two bits here are really just looking at things like trends in the industry. So again, this is really looking at things like threat intelligence, deeply looking at your organization to say, where are my security incidents coming from? Are they generally authentication related? Are they, more related to things like vulnerabilities in your environment? So once you have a good understanding about that, these are great inputs to really help build out your overall zero trust strategy. So in the middle, various types of processes here. There's not really one way to help build out this architecture, but again, trying to consume and ingest as much qualitative and quantitative data that you can. So across the left, not all of that data is qualitative or quantitative, it's a mix. So it's really imperative to really build out some processes so that you can consume that data in a meaningful way and really get to kind of the output, which is the last bit here on the right is, this is where you need to get to. This is kind of the result of processing all of this data is that once you thoroughly understand kind of the inputs that are coming in on the left-hand side, this will really help you articulate and able to define a very robust zero trust architecture for your organization. So a couple of other key aspects to help you inform your overall zero trust strategy is that making sure that you have a holistic approach, right? Making sure that you thoroughly think about the big picture and how these systems overall integrate and interoperate. The next bit here is really just focusing on building an ecosystem of controls, making sure that these controls are very much synergistic. I think, a lot of times historically, security practitioners were really focused on buying best-of-breed solutions and kind of standalone security controls, but I think Zero Trust definitely changes that, and really also really helps when you start to leverage telemetry and some of the contextual information, how you can share those across platforms. Making sure that your strategy is aligned with the broader corporate security strategies. So when we talked about some of the transformations that are happening, both the application, network transformation, and security transformation is really deeply understanding your organization to understand where you are in that journey so that as you build your zero trust strategy, that you're also aligned to that. And then last is, not constraining your zero trust strategy with your current state environment. And I think this is also a challenge is, why we're also recommending that you do this exercise really as a greenfield approach. So start literally with a blank whiteboard, not trying to sort of retrofit or bolt zero trust onto your current architecture, but really starting from a greenfield, and then obviously you can iterate backwards from that. But I think if you clearly define what that end state looks like or what success looks like, you'll get to a much better place in the end. Okay, chapter 4. So again, this is really getting into the nuts and bolts of migrating to a zero trust architecture. So as we move away from the whiteboard and move into an actionable strategy, this is what we're going to talk about here. So where do most people start? So zero trust is many things to many people. Very much a hot button issue in the world of cybersecurity these days. But generally, I would say that there are kind of 4 common use cases that folks start with when they start to move to zero trust. First is going to be threat protection. And again, this is really about reducing attack surface, reducing blast radius if something bad does happen, that you want to really minimize the collateral damage here. Second is going to be data protection. And again, this is really just making sure that we can secure the loss of sensitive data or other types of intellectual property and so on. Third is network segmentation. So really trying to prevent things like lateral movement, some of the massive challenges with network-centric architectures. And then last is improving business agility. So this is really how do you de-risk and also accelerate business initiatives within your organization. So we've got 4 use cases here that we've talked about kind of at a very high level, kind of at a macro level, but we'll get into each one of these and dive just a little bit deeper into these. So this is a good example of threat protection with zero trust. So on the left-hand side, what you see is a very traditional network-style architecture, lots of interconnected networks, so on and so forth. But what you see here is that there are a lot of public IPs, right? A lot of attack surface. You've got firewalls, VPN concentrators, various types of application and resources that exist out there. But all of these things generally have public IPs or have firewall connections that allow them to be publicly reachable. You'll often see here that a lot of the primary security controls are generally things like firewalls. So you don't often see things like SSL decryption or TLS termination, not really sophisticated sandboxing capabilities and those sorts of things. But really, again, just relying on IP-based controls. Whereas on the right really describes a zero trust architecture. So making sure that you have capabilities to fully decrypt SSL and TLS, really to understand the context of what those payloads look like and what those payloads actually contain. Another interesting part about the architecture on the right is that when you move to this model, you can start to build and augment a lot of the security capabilities that exist in there, right? You have a single place to enforce security and cyber and business policy. So things like threat correlation, advanced firewall capabilities, sandboxing, even things like cloud isolation and deception and those sorts of things. And you'll also note on the right-hand side that the endpoints aren't directly reachable. So there's no real IP connectivity between these things, and this really allows you to get to a place where you can air gap a lot of resources, which provides obviously a lot of additional security benefits. So data protection with zero trust. I think this is probably one of the most compelling reasons to move towards a zero trust model, and what we're seeing in the industry is that the need to protect data is critically important. And at a high level, there's kind of three broad use cases here. So first is really preventing data loss or leakage to the public internet. These are things like obviously ransomware and these sorts of things. What we also see is unsanctioned IT or even shadow IT. So making sure that your users, maybe you're an Office 365 shop, or maybe you use Box or Dropbox, but how are you ensuring that users are not going to things like unsanctioned applications and uploading sensitive data? Second here is really talking about managing third-party or vendor access. So again, not putting those vendors, not putting those third parties physically onto your network, but simply granting them access to the resources and services that they need access to. Maybe they just need access to an administrative portal. Maybe they just need to SSH or RDP to a system. That doesn't inherently mean that they need to be put onto the network to achieve that. And then last is, again, BYOD and unmanaged. Very difficult problems from a cybersecurity perspective to solve for, but providing capabilities and controls so that you can really control sensitive data or access to critical business applications. So this is an illustration of how you achieve segmentation with zero trust. And again, notice that all of that traffic flows centrally through the policy enforcement point, or the PEP. That's really the common theme here, is that there's a broker and all of these connections are flowing through that. So again, this really removes that direct interaction, and then that allows you to provide these various types of controls to govern that traffic, so that you make sure that all of that traffic is supported by your business and cybersecurity policies. This is also how you can really get into a good model where if you want to air gap your systems, maybe you have some critical system, some crown jewel application, code repository, whatever the case may be, this also allows you to get to a place where you can wholly air gap that system. Literally, the inbound firewalls can be deny any, or deny IP any. And you can still provide access to that based on identity and based on context. So mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. I realize this is a little bit of a use case and doesn't really apply broadly, but it's also one area in which zero trust is really powerful and really effective. So in previous years, we spent a lot of time, when there was a merger or when there was an acquisition, that really involved what we see on the left-hand side here, which is really about interconnecting networks, trying to facilitate communication between these, both the acquired and the acquiring property. This created a lot of complexity, right? Creating either VPNs, private VPNs, maybe even extending physical circuits to these locations. But this created a lot of challenges with things like overlapping IP addresses, created a lot of challenge with doing things like NAT, network address translation, right? You'd had to have different NAT rules to really overcome overlapping IP addresses and so on and so forth. Very difficult problem to solve. I think it also doesn't really respect one of the tenets of Zero Trust, which is also about assuming breach. So if you assume that that other network is breached, then why would you want to interconnect those networks? It's probably the last thing that you would want to do. And again, what we see on the right with the Zero Trust approach is that instead of doing this complex interconnection and really trying to merge these networks or somehow join these things, instead what you need to do is just simply using both identity and context is just providing access, right? So from a named user to a named resource. So for example, giving Brian access to Salesforce or giving Brian access to some internal application running in your data center. That's a much easier proposition than trying to wholesale connect networks broadly. So within the world of Zero Trust, there's Zero Trust network access, and this is really one of the ways in which things like traditional VPN are slowly starting to be deprecated. So we're really talking here about, from a Zero Trust perspective, how do you access a network resource? So this illustration really talks kind of at a high level to what the actual traffic flow would look like. So again, the parts in the middle of this with all of the various boxes, this is really the policy enforcement point, or what you see in the previous diagrams with the PEP, or that blue line that interconnected everything. So on the left-hand side, just moving kind of west to east on this diagram, what we see is, on the left-hand side, we really see sources. So these could be endpoints, these could be workloads, these could be IoT devices. And then on the right-hand side, what we see are destinations. So these are application servers, these are resources, these are SaaS components. They could potentially be other types of things like IoT and so on and so forth. So as a connection is trying to be initiated from the left-hand side here, what you see is when this traffic hits the PEP, that the very first thing that it does, it's able to decrypt this traffic. This is where you really start to look deeply into the payloads and provides a lot of the inspection capabilities. So you're able to immediately sort of understand, what are the source, some of the source components, where is that traffic ultimately going to in terms of destination. And then you'll also start to get into some of the posture type information and really the context, which ports and protocols, also starting to consume a lot of the telemetry that you have from your broader ecosystem. So the PKI systems, some of your inventory, some of your patching and vulnerability management systems, really starting to deeply understand the context of those things. As we move into Verify, this is the step in which we already kind of know where the traffic is destined. We know what the source is. We have a little bit deeper understanding about the posture of the device and the context of the connection. This is where we start to challenge for things like authentication and authorization. So obviously these things are generally presented as SAML or SCIM integrations to an identity provider. That identity provider is provided within your organization. And this is really where you can become very powerful and also build a lot of automation into Zero Trust to say, based on these types of metadata or based on these types of identity attributes, you can really provide, kind of automagic access to a lot of these resources and so on. The other bit that happens in Verify, which is critically important, is you start to, because the traffic is already decrypted at this point and you have access to the payload, well, then you can really start to understand what the data is. So we get into identifying the data. So, is the data labeled? Maybe you need to do some type of, IDM or EDM, index data matching or exact data matching, or even OCR capabilities to say, is this sensitive data? Does this type of data violate any business policies or cybersecurity policies within your organization? So, is it PHI? Is it HIPAA data? Is it financial data, SOX, whatever the case may be? And really starting to deeply understand the context of that data. The last bit here in Verify is again, threat protection, right? So making sure that as these connections are brokered, that exploits aren't happening, that people aren't downloading malicious code, known bad libraries and vulnerabilities and these sorts of things. So deeply understanding the threats of that traffic. And then getting into brokering. So this is really about making sure that you're able to enforce the traffic policies, and then really just making sure that you can facilitate and broker those connections. So really, if you think about what's happening in the middle, is really where you're applying policy, and you're basically just stitching together the connections between the sources and the destinations based on policy. So chapter 5. So this is really where we're going to get into talking about your board and making sure that you have successful deployments for your Zero Trust architecture. So Zero Trust is obviously, it is hard. I have done this at several organizations, and I think one of the things that I quickly learned is really just having a bias towards action, making sure that you do not get too deep into this analysis paralysis, and really just building convictions around some of the outcomes. Also, not rotating on perfect, right? Oftentimes as you start this Zero Trust journey, really, you're not talking about really finishing this for, maybe 36 months or 24 months out. So you don't necessarily have to get it right out of the gates. So just, don't let, perfection be the enemy of progress. Really, again, in the same vein, just, don't overthink and start doing, getting some wins as you ultimately develop your broader vision and strategy, as you gain consensus across the organization, things with, boards, stakeholders, so on and so forth. The next bit here is really about taking the first step and really making sure that you don't boil the ocean, otherwise you'll never start. There's another slide here where it really talks about the different types of methodologies, so whether or not you want to be really opportunistic about this or even selectively applying Zero Trust principles. The good news is that there's a lot of ways to get yourself into a Zero Trust architecture. There's really no one path, and we'll talk about some of those best practices as well. Also, just making sure that you can build confidence with smaller, attainable wins. And then lastly, expanding strategically. So making sure that you can really quantify risk and then prioritize accordingly. This is really where you're able to really use risk to drive prioritization across your organization. And then just really understanding what success looks like, defining it, socializing it, and evolving it. So this was the part that I previously mentioned here. So I think as we start to really talk about the actionable part, like really putting this into practice and starting to implement Zero Trust, I think from my perspective, there's kind of two different ways. One is selectively, and then the other is really about opportunistically. So selectively, what we really talk about here is you're purposely trying to solve something. So maybe you have, from a cybersecurity risk perspective or from an enterprise risk management perspective, you have a very particular problem you're trying to solve for. That is a very selective type of approach. Maybe there's a cybersecurity capability that you simply don't have in your environment. Data protection, maybe cloud protection, so on and so forth. So again, this is about being very selective about the types of capabilities you're putting out there. Whereas opportunistically doing it is sort of the reverse. This is really about using things like, maybe you have some legacy hardware or some security stack within your data center, and it's coming up for hardware renewal. Maybe that hardware is being EOL'd or end-of-lifed, and using kind of those milestones to really help say, hey, maybe we shouldn't renew this piece of hardware. Maybe this is the opportunity to try a different approach. So again, as with all things, your mileage may vary here, but these are at a very high level. These are where I've seen programs be very successful of implementing Zero Trust. So now our favorite topic here, the board. So as you prepare to speak with your board about Zero Trust, these are some general considerations. Quite a few here. What I would say first is that it's important to understand that obviously not all boards are created equal. So you'll have wildly differing levels of cybersecurity expertise in your organization. So it's important to know the audience. Very critical to know what your audience is so that you can appropriately present that data. Also, making sure that you view this through the lens of your industry vertical. So if you're in healthcare or financial services, or maybe you work for a tech company, really trying to talk about Zero Trust in that context, making sure that it's very applicable to the type of industry that you work in. The next one here is really that there is not a single methodology or approach to presenting to the board. there's been a tremendous number of books about talking about metrics and these sorts of things and how you present to the board. But I think my approach here is really to broadly talk about a lot of the themes and to make the information as consumable as possible. Not getting into single individual control statistics like how many sessions got blocked or how many emails got flagged for spam or something. That I just don't necessarily see a lot of those values. But what I do see value in doing is really comprehensively and deeply talking about things like risk. Talking about any material incidents your organization had, any types of breaches that you may have experienced, broadly talking about the maturity of your program, the capabilities of your programs, and really getting into some of those priorities as well. Fourth here is about just really aligning the cybersecurity initiatives to the broader macro trends within your organization. So maybe you're in the process of migrating to cloud. You're moving to AWS or GCP or in Azure. So really, what are the implications on your cybersecurity program? And really socializing that broadly with the board. Fifth here is just really focusing on being brilliant at the basics, not getting into a lot of the security theater and then some of these emotional things or things that we see in the news or in the New York Times and so on and so forth, but really just making sure that you can really focus on being brilliant at the basics and those sorts of things. And last here is, when you're in the context of your board, is really about just finding opportunities to really have deep dialogue and conversation with them. So what you often see is these are things like tabletop exercises and really having your board deeply involved with those. So as you start to really get into articulating Zero Trust to your board, there are sort of 4 essential topics that you need to address here. First is that, and this is really focused on risk, is that setting the context that cybersecurity is an enterprise, really existential risk and not simply an IT issue. So for those of you who are CISOs and you report to a CIO, this is a little bit challenging because cybersecurity risk is obviously more broad than just within the scope of IT. Second would be demonstrating improvements to your overall maturity and or capabilities. The last is trying to get alignment with other types of risk management frameworks or other types of compliance frameworks. So again, these are things like NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework, perhaps even ISO 27001 for a lot of international organizations. And last is business agility. Really how are you supporting your organization as they transform? So very last slide before we get into Q&A here is really trying to apply what we've learned today. So this is broken down into a couple of different sections. So, in the first week, the idea here is that you're really going to focus on the why. You can reference back to that why slide is really understanding the drivers for Zero Trust, and then really socializing those outcomes with your stakeholder community. So the IT teams, your network security teams, so on and so forth, and making sure that you have alignment on the relative priorities. In the first 3 months, you should really start getting into the what. So this is really, as you start to really formalize and build out a Zero Trust architecture, really starting to apply those Zero Trust principles, having good understanding and good confidence about what that ultimately looks like. And then as you do that, obviously the next logical step here is really starting to assemble a cross-functional team, right? Multidisciplinary team. So these are network folks, these are your identity folks, even a lot of your infrastructure teams, even engineering organizations, to really make sure that as you move to this architecture that you're really trying to solve for all of these use cases and that you're taking all of these various types of things into consideration. Then within 6 months is really focused on the how. So at this point, you've really understood why you're doing Zero Trust. You deeply understand kind of that future state architecture. This is really about moving into the how. So really building out a comprehensive strategy to say, we do now know what success looks like. We're all comfortable with that. We've socialized that broadly. So really getting in again to these opportunities, either selectively or opportunistically, to build out a lot of these capabilities. And then last but not least is continuing to confer and advise your board and keep them up to date. And this also includes things like if you're reporting to the audit committee or if you have a risk committee in your organization, and making sure that there's broad understanding and collaboration across the organization. So again, thank you so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. From a time perspective, are we at time or? Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I'm happy to field some additional questions if you're interested.